They ran over my lawn again. The tires crushed the grass, leaving behind deep tracks in the soil I had spent hours grooming. It wasn't the first time Karen had done this. It wasn't even the 10th, but this time, something snapped. Karen, in her pristine white Lexus, speeding through my yard like it was some kind of racetrack. I could feel my blood boil as I stood there watching her. The sound of the rubber burning against the grass, screech, screech, it felt like she was mocking me. I'd warned her before, even spoken to the HOA about it, but Karen didn't care. My property, my time, my lawn, to her it was all just another thing to trample over. But this time was different. I wasn't going to stand by and let it happen again. The frustration had been building, but now, as I stood there, fists clenched, I realized something. I wasn't just angry anymore, this was personal. She wasn't going to get away with this. So, when Karen drove away, leaving my lawn a mess, I knew one thing for sure: the next time she races through my yard, there will be consequences. And this time, I'll make sure she never forgets it. And she won't even see it coming. My name's Marcus Reed, and this property has been in my family for 3 generations. It's not much to anyone else, but to me, it's everything. The lawn, the garden, even the old oak tree in the corner. Everything here tells a story. My grandfather planted that tree, tended to this land, and now it's my turn to care for it. Every morning, I wake up, step outside, and take in the peace. The fresh scent of grass, the chirping birds, the breeze rustling through the trees. It's all I've known. But when Willow Creek Estates was built next door, everything changed. The developers tore through the land, creating a neighborhood of brand new homes. At first I didn't think much of it, just a few new neighbors. But then came the HOA. Karen Blackwater. The moment she became president of the HOA, everything started to shift. She wasn't happy with how things looked around here. My lawn, the trees, the way I let the grass grow a little wild. It wasn't what she thought was proper. She wasn't the first to complain, but Karen was relentless. She pushed her vision of perfection on everyone, making sure every lawn looked identical. My lawn? It was unsightly. A devaluation of the neighborhood, according to her. Her complaints turned into threats. But here's the thing. This lawn, this property, wasn't just grass. It was a part of me. It was my history. And Karen wasn't going to take it from me. Not without a fight. At first it was subtle. A few tire marks here and there, a slight inconvenience. But Karen didn't stop. She didn't care. It wasn't long before I realized this wasn't just about her driving across my lawn. It was about her need to control everything around her, about forcing her idea of perfection on everyone. The first time I noticed her speeding through my lawn, I was on the porch, enjoying a rare morning without the usual racket of the world. The sun had just crept over the horizon, casting a soft glow on the grass. I remember the smell of freshly cut clover mixed with the damp earth, the breeze gently brushing my face. It was peaceful. My lawn had always been a place of tranquility, a space where my grandfather's legacy lived, where I could be alone with my thoughts. Then I heard it, the unmistakable roar of an engine revving up. I looked up just in time to see Karen's white Lexus tear across my lawn like it was a racetrack. Her tires shredded the grass, leaving deep impressions in the soil. I could hear the rubber grinding against the earth, a sound that felt like nails on a chalkboard to me. My stomach twisted in anger as I watched her barrel through my yard without a care. She didn't even slow down. I stood there, frozen in disbelief, my fists clenched at my sides. The tire tracks remained long after she was gone, a constant reminder of her disregard. I didn't confront her at first. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. After all, she didn't seem to care much about the damage, but it happened again, and again. Each time it got worse. She would speed down the street and veer off onto my lawn, cutting across the edges like it was a shortcut. Sometimes she parked her car halfway on my yard, as if she owned it. Every time she did it, I felt a little more helpless, a little more frustrated. She was encroaching on something that was sacred to me, a place that had been my family's for decades. And every time she tore across it, I felt like she was tearing into my history. I tried to handle it the polite way at first. I left her a note, a simple, respectful request asking her to stop driving on my lawn. I wasn't confrontational, just straightforward. I told her I took pride in my property and didn't appreciate it being treated like a playground. I figured a little civility would go a long way. Her response? She ignored it. No apology, no acknowledgement, just the sound of her car speeding by the next day, and the day after that. I began to feel like a fool for thinking anything would change. Then came the HOA. I had already heard rumors about Karen's influence in the neighborhood. She had this way of getting things done, of pushing her agenda on others. She was relentless, a bulldozer in designer clothes. The moment she took control of the HOA, it was clear that things were about to get worse. Suddenly, my old, quiet neighborhood was crawling with new rules and restrictions, all dictated by her. The HOA meetings, which were once a formality, turned into Karen's personal stage for enforcing her will. The first time the HOA got involved, it was over something petty. Karen had called a formal meeting to discuss the unsightly nature of my lawn. She presented her case, as she always did, with a smile that was anything but friendly. She claimed my grass was too untamed, my garden too wild. She even suggested I tear down the old oak tree because it was unsightly and didn't fit the aesthetic of the neighborhood. The HOA, of course, sided with her. The president, who had always been spineless, nodded along, agreeing that the neighborhood's property value could be harmed by my unkempt lawn. They sent me a formal letter warning me to clean up my yard or face fine. It was one of the most insulting things I'd ever received. Here I was, trying to maintain the legacy of my grandfather, and Karen had the audacity to call it a liability. The worst part? It wasn't just about my lawn anymore. The HOA had enabled her. They didn't care about my history or my memories, only what they thought was presentable. Karen's influence in the HOA gave her the power to make everyone else bend to her will, even if it meant disregarding personal boundaries and history. As the weeks passed, the frustration grew. The damage to my lawn wasn't just physical, it was personal. The tire marks left by Karen's car became a constant reminder of her disregard. The grass, once vibrant and green, started to look trampled. It wasn't just a lawn anymore, it felt like my dignity was being trampled with each passing day. The sound of her tires grinding across the grass became a trigger for my growing frustration. The sight of her car parked half on my yard made my blood boil. I started to wonder how much longer I could stand it. I tried being patient, I tried being reasonable, but with every violation, every casual disregard for my space, I felt a little more like I was losing control. I began to realize I was trapped in a neighborhood that no longer respected personal boundaries, trapped by a woman who thought she could do whatever she wanted, and trapped by a system that empowered her. And that's when it hit me. I couldn't let it go on like this. If the HOA wasn't going to stop her, then it was up to me to take matters into my own hands. It was a Tuesday morning when I stood on the porch, watching Karen's Lexus tear across my lawn once again, tires screeching as she cut through the grass without a second thought. My blood boiled, and I clenched my fist so tightly that my knuckles turned white. How many times would this have to happen? How many times would I stand by and let her destroy my property before I did something about it? For the past few weeks, I'd been stewing over the endless disrespect, the fines, and the HOA's inability to rein in Karen. The frustration had built up to a point where it was no longer just about the lawn. It was about my dignity, my family's history, and my right to have a peaceful space. I had tried to be the better person. I had tried to take the high road, but after the last HOA letter, after Karen had plowed across my yard again like it was nothing more than a speed bump, I had finally reached my limit. I was done being passive. It was time to take control back. I spent the next couple of days pacing, thinking, and quietly plotting. The idea started small, just a flicker in the back of my mind, something I could do to make her pay for her inconsiderate behavior. But as the days passed, the idea took shape, and I found myself planning with a level of precision that even surprised me. I needed to teach her a lesson she wouldn't forget. I had to hit her where it would hurt, without causing any real harm, of course. What could make her think twice about driving through my yard again? Then it hit me: spikes. I'd heard of it before, people planting spikes under their grass to deter trespassers. The idea felt almost poetic, and the more I thought about it, the more I liked it. Something simple, yet effective. A quiet warning that said, "You're not welcome here." Now, I'm no expert on landscaping, but I was damn good with my hands. I had rebuilt my deck from scratch last year, installed new fencing, and even put in a few flower beds that, be honest, Karen probably would have called disruptive. So planting spikes wasn't exactly out of my wheelhouse. But this was different. This wasn't just about fixing something, it was about taking action, about asserting control. The plan came together over the course of a few nights, each one spent researching, gathering supplies, and figuring out how to make the spikes discreet enough not to be noticed, but effective enough to stop her in her tracks. I bought a bag of steel spikes from the local hardware store, along with a few other tools I'd need: a shovel, some old tarpaulin, and heavy-duty garden gloves. I made sure to pick the thickest spikes I could find, something sturdy enough to hold its ground against the weight of her car. The night I set everything up, I couldn't shake the nervous excitement buzzing in my chest. My pulse quickened as I dug small holes just deep enough to hide the spikes. The grass was soft under my feet, the smell of the earth filling my nose, but my mind was laser-focused. I carefully spaced the spikes out, like a soldier setting up traps, covering them back up with soil and grass. The whole process felt like a strange, twisted form of empowerment. Finally, I was taking control of a situation I'd been powerless in for far too long. At one point I had to stop and laugh to myself. The whole thing felt a little ridiculous. Here I was, a grown man, a retired electrician mind you, spending his evening planting spikes in his lawn like a mad scientist. What if someone found out? What if I accidentally hit my own foot, or, God forbid, someone else's tire? But as quickly as those thoughts came, they disappeared. I had to do this. She had made it clear that nothing else would work. And as much as I hated to admit it, I felt oddly satisfied as I worked. The more spikes I planted, the more I could almost feel the power returning to me. The following morning, I stood on the porch again, watching the sun break through the trees. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand. The grass looked no different than it had before, except now, hidden beneath it, was a silent, sharp message. And then it happened. By mid-afternoon, Karen's Lexus came tearing down the road, just like clockwork. I could hear the engine before I saw her, the low growl of it building in the distance. My heart began to race, and I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't show any sign of what I had done. But as she neared the edge of my property, I felt a rush of adrenaline flood my system. She veered toward the familiar stretch of lawn she'd taken so many times before. I watched, frozen, as she accelerated, right for the very spot where I had carefully hidden the spikes, and then it happened. Crunch. I heard it clearly from the porch, the unmistakable sound of metal biting into rubber. Her car jolted, the tires deflating almost instantly. I couldn't help the small grin that crept onto my face. It was a perfect hit. Karen slammed on the brakes, swerving to the side. She stepped out of the car, cursing under her breath, as she looked down at the damage. Her eyes darted to the lawn, as if she could somehow will the spikes to disappear. It was all I could do to keep from laughing. This wasn't just about the tire though, it was about her realizing that she was no longer in control, that for once, there was a price to pay for disrespecting someone's space. As Karen called the tow truck, yelling and throwing her hands up in frustration, I stayed on the porch, watching her. Her voice carried through the quiet morning air, but I couldn't hear her words. All I could think about was the sweet, sweet sense of vindication I felt deep in my chest. She wouldn't mess with me again. The morning after Karen's tire incident, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I watched the tow truck drag her Lexus off my lawn, the tires still deflated and her face red with frustration. It was a strange mix of satisfaction and guilt. Satisfaction because I had finally done something that sent a message, but guilt because, well, what if this was a step too far? What if I had crossed a line? But that feeling of guilt faded quickly. As the day passed and Karen's car was hauled away, a quiet certainty settled in my chest. I had made my point. The lawn was mine, not hers. And if she wanted to keep treating it like a playground, there would be consequences. The more I thought about it, the more I felt empowered. The plan had worked. She had been stopped in her tracks, and I hadn't even had to raise my voice. No yelling, no confrontation, just pure, silent retribution. The beauty of it was in its simplicity, and now that she knew the price of messing with me, I wasn't going to stop. I'd made my move, and Karen would have to learn to respect the boundaries I'd set. I spent the next couple of days watching her, quietly observing. I wasn't sure what her next move would be, but I could see the frustration written all over her face every time she walked past my house. She had parked in front of her house, staring at the empty spot where her car had been. Her eyes darted toward my lawn more than once, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in her head. She was smart enough to know that what happened wasn't an accident, but I knew she wouldn't connect the dots just yet. Then, just when I thought things might calm down, she did something that almost pushed me to the edge. It was a Thursday afternoon, around the time when I normally start winding down for the day, my work done and the evening air settling in. I was on the porch, sipping my iced tea, watching the birds as they fluttered between the trees. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the yard. It was a perfect evening, but I knew it wouldn't last. That's when I heard the engine. I looked up, my eyes narrowing. There was Karen driving down the street with an air of entitlement that made my blood run cold. She slowed down as she approached my lawn, looking almost like she was sizing it up, trying to decide what to do. I could see the wheels turning in her head, but then, without warning, she did something that made me freeze. Karen pulled her car up to the edge of my yard again. Not in front of her house, not on her side of the street. She was parking on my lawn. I watched, mouth agape, as she pulled over to the side, parked right on the edge of the grass, and left her engine running. She didn't even get out of the car. She just sat there, glaring at me from her side mirror. I don't know what made her think this was okay. Was she testing me? Was she daring me to do something? But in that moment, I felt my patience snap. It wasn't just about my lawn anymore, it was about her complete and utter disregard for my space, for my rules. I had warned her, I had taken my stand, and now here she was, pushing me, testing my boundaries once again. Without a word, I got up from my chair and walked across the yard toward her car. Every step felt like it was bringing me closer to a final confrontation, but I couldn't stop myself. As I approached, Karen finally looked up from the mirror, her eyes locking onto mine. Her expression was one of surprise, as if she didn't expect me to take action so quickly. "What do you think you're doing?" I asked, my voice steady but laced with frustration. She gave a weak smile, clearly unbothered. "Oh, just thought I'd park here for a minute. What's the big deal?" I could feel my hands tighten into fists. "The big deal is that this is my property. You've already torn up my lawn once. Do you really want to test me again?" Her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "It's just a little parking. No harm done." "No harm done?" I repeated. "Karen, this is my space, not yours. I've asked you and I've warned you. You don't get to just do whatever you want here. Do you understand?" For a moment she didn't respond, just stared at me with that same haughty expression she always wore. But I could see the unease creeping into her eyes, just the slightest flicker of doubt. Maybe she was realizing she had pushed me too far this time. I waited, watching her carefully. She took a deep breath, clearly unwilling to back down completely. But she did what I didn't expect. She put the car in reverse and backed off my lawn without another word. I stood there watching her retreat. The engine hummed softly as she rolled back onto the street. But the message had been sent. She knew now that there were limits. And while I wasn't about to back down, I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of a bigger scene. As her car disappeared into the distance, I took a deep breath, releasing the tension that had been building in my chest. My heart was still racing, but I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't over yet, but it was a step toward reclaiming what was mine. This was my home, my lawn, and no one, not even Karen Blackwater, was going to take it from me. For the first time in weeks, I could almost feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. The battle wasn't over, but it was just beginning, and I had a feeling Karen would soon find out that I wasn't someone she could push around. The next morning, I woke to the usual quiet of my neighborhood, the birds chirping, the breeze rustling the leaves on the oak tree. But as I stepped onto the porch, something felt different. It wasn't the calmness of the morning that usually brought peace to my heart. No, it was the anticipation of the storm I knew was about to hit. As I looked down the street, I saw her car parked at the curb. Karen's Lexus still there, but this time it wasn't just a minor inconvenience. I could feel my pulse quicken as I approached the window and looked out over the lawn. And then I saw it, the tire tracks. Not the usual ones, but deep, jagged impressions in the soil where her car had gotten stuck on the spikes. I felt my chest tighten. It was a perfect hit, no doubt about it, but as I walked closer, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. The sun was barely up, and the first thing I noticed was Karen standing next to her car, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. She was staring down at the punctured tire, muttering to herself, no doubt trying to figure out what had happened. Her hands shook as she inspected the damage, and I could almost feel the heat of her anger from where I stood. I stayed inside, hidden behind the blinds, watching the scene unfold. She looked around, likely checking if anyone had seen her car stuck in the middle of my lawn. But of course, no one was around. It was just Karen and the wreckage of her arrogance. As she reached for her phone, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's drama unfold. But deep down, I couldn't deny the feeling of victory that rushed through me. This wasn't just about the lawn anymore, it was about asserting my right to peace, to respect. For a moment I almost convinced myself that I had done the right thing, but then the doubt started creeping in. Had I gone too far? I had planted spikes in my lawn after all. Sure, I'd gotten revenge. Yes, Karen had learned her lesson. But what if someone else had driven over them? What if one of the kids in the neighborhood had wandered onto my property and gotten hurt? The thought made me feel sick to my stomach, but I quickly shoved it aside. I wasn't trying to cause harm. I just wanted her to stop. But then the worst part happened. Karen started pacing around her car, muttering louder now, shaking her head as if she was in denial. I saw her face turn red with frustration. I knew she was about to cause a scene, and when she whipped her phone out and dialed the number, I could already feel the tension building. The HOA would get involved. I didn't know how or when, but I could feel it coming. By noon I was right. The first letter arrived, official, stamped with the HOA's logo. It was a formal complaint citing property damage and unsafe conditions due to the spikes in my yard. My stomach dropped when I saw the envelope. I opened it slowly, knowing exactly what it would say. The letter was short and to the point. The HOA demanded that I immediately remove the spikes and make reparations to Karen for her car damage. They threatened to escalate it if I refused. There was no mention of her violating my property, no mention of her repeatedly driving on my lawn, just a one-sided biased letter placing all the blame on me. As I read through it, my frustration boiled up again. Karen had done what she wanted for months, trampling all over my property, and now that she had faced the smallest consequence, I was the one being punished. I felt a wave of anger that surged through my veins, and for a moment I considered ignoring the HOA, refusing to comply with their ridiculous demands. But then reality hit me. The legal pressure was mounting. I couldn't afford another lawsuit, especially not with the way things were going in this neighborhood. The HOA was powerful, and Karen, with her lawyer connections and her self-proclaimed property value knowledge, would stop at nothing to make me pay. The following day, I received a phone call from Karen herself. I wasn't surprised, but I didn't know what to expect. Her voice was cold, dripping with anger. "You've gone too far, Marcus," she said, the words sharp like knives. "You think this is funny? You've ruined my car." I didn't say anything at first. My stomach churned, and I could hear her breathing on the other end. She was furious, and I didn't blame her. After all, her pristine, perfect world had been shaken. But as I stood there, a part of me felt justified. She had crossed a line, and this was the price. "You shouldn't have driven across my lawn," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I told you, I've asked you to stop." But Karen didn't care. She raged on, blaming me for everything. She went on about the HOA, about how I would pay for the damage, how they were going to come after me legally. She even threatened to bring in her lawyer. I didn't need to hear the rest. The truth was clear. This wasn't just about a few tire marks anymore. Karen wasn't just angry, she was out for blood. And the HOA was right behind her. That evening I sat at the kitchen table, the letter from the HOA still lying in front of me. I ran my hands through my hair, trying to think through what came next. The legal pressure was real. The HOA had already made it clear that they were involved, and Karen wouldn't stop until I'd paid for her damaged car, and probably more. I couldn't let this spiral out of control, but I also couldn't let her win. I wasn't about to back down. As I weighed my options, my phone buzzed. Another letter from the HOA. This one came with a warning. If I didn't comply with their demands, they would take the matter to court. The threat was clear. They had the power, and they weren't afraid to use it. But the more I read their letter, the more I saw the same thing I had seen in the past. No mention of Karen's repeated violations or her role in all of this. It was all about punishing me, the one person who had dared to stand up for himself. I spent the next few hours pacing, thinking, and wondering what would happen next. The emotional turmoil was real. The pressure from the HOA was mounting. But somewhere deep inside, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to back down. This was my property, and I would fight for it, no matter the consequences. It didn't take long for the HOA to make its next move. Less than a week after Karen's car had been towed off my lawn, I received an official summons to the next HOA meeting. The letter was written in that pompous, overly formal tone, filled with legal jargon, but the message was clear. I was being accused of property damage, unsafe conditions, and violating HOA rules. I knew this was coming. What I didn't expect was how far Karen and the HOA were willing to go. When I walked into that meeting, I could already feel the tension in the air. Karen was seated at the front, her usual smug expression firmly in place, as if she had already won. Her eyes met mine briefly as I entered, and she didn't even try to hide the triumphant look on her face. She had turned the entire situation into a spectacle, and now it was my turn to defend myself. The room was filled with the usual suspects, members of the HOA board who all seemed to hang on Karen's every word. Her influence in the neighborhood had grown stronger than ever. As the meeting began, I listened as she spoke, her words dripping with condescension. "I'm sure we're all aware of the recent incident involving Mr. Reed's lawn," she began, her voice as cold as ice. "As you can see, the situation escalated quickly, leading to personal property damage. We've seen the tire tracks and the spikes that were so cleverly hidden." She paused dramatically, letting the words settle in, as if trying to build some kind of case against me. "I'm not sure what message Mr. Reed was trying to send," she continued, her tone accusatory. "But this isn't just a minor inconvenience. This is a serious safety hazard. We can't allow this kind of behavior to continue in Willow Creek. It's not only damaging the property, it's creating an unsafe environment for everyone. Karen's voice dripped with venom, and I could hear the undertones of a personal vendetta in her words. She wasn't just angry, she was weaponizing the HOA against me, and she had the full support of the board. I stood up to speak, trying to steady my nerves as I addressed the group. I'll admit that I took action, but Karen's actions driving over my lawn repeatedly were not just disrespectful, they were damaging, and I had asked her repeatedly to stop. The room was silent for a moment, but Karen didn't let up. She jumped in, her voice louder and more forceful. I don't see how that justifies placing spikes on your lawn. That's not only reckless, it's dangerous. I've already contacted my lawyer about this. The mention of her lawyer was enough to make my stomach churn. I knew she had the power to make things difficult, but the constant pressure, the constant threat of legal action, it was starting to take a toll on me. But I couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything. The rest of the meeting was a blur of accusations, threats, and whispered conversations behind closed doors. The HOA members seemed to be buying into Karen's narrative, their faces painted with judgment. I tried to argue my case, but it was like talking to a wall. Every word I said was met with more legal jargon, more talk of fines and possible court actions. I could feel the weight of their stares on me as the meeting dragged on. They weren't hearing me, they were hearing Karen, and whatever she said, they took as gospel. My reputation in the neighborhood was at risk, and the deeper I got into the conversation, the more isolated I felt. The pressure to conform, to submit to Karen's will, was suffocating. It wasn't until the end of the meeting that things started to shift. As the meeting was about to adjourn, one of the neighbors, Tom Martinez, a middle-aged guy who lived 3 houses down, stood up. I didn't know him very well, but I'd spoken to him a few times over the years. He wasn't one for HOA politics, always keeping to himself, but today, he stood up for me. "Excuse me," Tom said, his voice strong but calm. "I think there's something we should all consider here." The room fell silent, and Karen's eyes narrowed as she turned toward him. "Mr. Reed is right about one thing," Tom continued. "Karen, you've been pushing your vision of the neighborhood onto everyone, and frankly, it's starting to feel like some of us are being bulldozed. I don't agree with everything Marcus did, but I understand why he did it. He's not the only one around here who feels like they've lost control of their own property." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. Tom had said what I had been too afraid to say. He put into words what a lot of us had been feeling. This HOA wasn't about community anymore, it was about power. Tom looked around the room, his gaze steady. "We all have a stake in this neighborhood, and we all deserve to feel safe in our own homes. If we're not careful, we're going to lose that, and when that happens, no one will win." It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time, I wasn't the only one standing up. The pressure lifted just slightly. I could see the others in the room start to nod, to glance around, unsure of how to respond. Karen's smug expression faltered, just for a second, but it was enough to show that Tom had planted a seed of doubt. The board members murmured among themselves, and Karen's calm exterior started to crack. She shot Tom a look, her lips pressed tightly together, but she didn't respond. The meeting ended shortly after that, but the damage was done. Karen had underestimated the power of a united front, and Tom's support had given me a sliver of hope. As I walked home, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. The battle wasn't over, but I wasn't alone anymore. It wasn't just about me fighting back against Karen, it was about the whole neighborhood fighting back against the system she was trying to build. Tom had shown me that the HOA wasn't invincible, and there were others who felt the same way. The next few days were tense. The HOA sent another letter, but this time, it was clear they were backpedaling. They were threatening legal action, but nothing was as certain as it had been before. There was a sense that the community was starting to see through Karen's manipulation. The days after Tom's unexpected support felt like a strange mix of victory and unease. The HOA's stance had shifted slightly, but the battle was far from over. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Karen's smirk, the way she always seemed to have an answer for everything, made me feel like the odds were still stacked against me. But then again, there was something different in the air now. The voices from the community weren't as easily silenced. It was in the middle of the next week when things took a turn. I was at the county clerk's office, trying to track down some old property records. My lawyer had mentioned that it might be useful to understand any historical agreements made with the land, just in case the HOA decided to escalate things further. The idea was simple: knowledge is power. The more I knew about the land and the laws governing it, the stronger my case would be if the HOA tried to bring legal action against me. What I didn't expect was to find a legal loophole that would completely flip the power dynamic between Karen and me. The moment I stepped into the dusty, dimly lit records room at the county office, I felt like I was entering another world. The air was thick with the scent of aging paper, and the fluorescent lights hummed above, flickering every now and then. I sifted through files, flipping through deed records, land transfers, and community agreements. Nothing unusual stood out, until I came across a file labeled Willow Creek Estates, Developers Permits and Water Rights. Curious, I pulled the file from the shelf and began to skim through the pages. At first it seemed like typical developer paperwork, permits for construction, surveys of the land, etc. But then something caught my eye, a specific paragraph buried in one of the developer's applications. It outlined the water rights for the area. I paused, my fingers tracing the underlined sections. The document stated that the developer, when they bought the land for Willow Creek Estates, had made a mistake. They didn't secure the water rights for the development. The water rights, the rights to the groundwater that supplied the entire neighborhood, were still legally held by the original landowner, my grandfather, who had passed them down to my family. I reread the document twice, then 3 times. My heart began to race as the realization hit me. The developer had never acquired the water rights. They had drilled into the very same underground aquifer that supplied Willow Creek Estates, but they never paid for the rights to the water, and those water rights were still mine. It was a stunning discovery, one that completely changed everything. I wasn't just dealing with an HOA and a woman who had overstepped her boundaries. I was sitting on the legal foundation that could potentially turn the tables completely. I knew right then that I needed to contact my lawyer immediately. As I walked out of the records room, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, replaced by an intense sense of empowerment. Finally, I had leverage. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the documents I had photocopied. My lawyer confirmed it the next day. The water rights were worth millions. More than that, they were the key to breaking the HOA's grip on the neighborhood. The next step would be the catalyst I needed to take Karen and the HOA down once and for all. Karen's mistake, the same mistake she had made years ago when she manipulated the HOA board, was going to cost her everything. I spent the next few days pulling together evidence, preparing my case. I was no longer just trying to protect my lawn. I was fighting for personal freedom, for the right to protect my family's legacy. And in the process, I was realizing that this fight wasn't just about me, it was about everyone who had been bullied by the HOA's overreach, about all the neighbors who felt powerless in the face of Karen's authoritarian rule. It didn't take long for me to realize that the water rights weren't the only issue. Karen had a lot more to worry about than just her HOA reign. As I started digging into the history of Willow Creek Estates and Karen's involvement in the development, things started to unravel for her. I learned that the developer, who was closely tied to Karen's interests, had been under investigation for environmental violations. The company had received multiple warnings from state regulators about mishandling water resources in the area. When I started putting the pieces together, it became clear that Karen had helped cover up a lot of the developer's mistakes. She'd even played a key role in securing permits that, quite frankly, shouldn't have been granted. That's when I made another connection. Karen's professional reputation was tied to the developer's real estate business. Her career as a lawyer, her influence in the community, and her role as HOA president all intersected with the very company that had illegally used my water rights. It wasn't just her ego on the line, it was her entire professional life. The next day, as I prepared to present my findings to my lawyer, Karen made her move. She sent me a letter demanding that I cease and desist with my claims of ownership over the water rights. The letter was filled with the usual threats, but this time, something was different. The tone wasn't just hostile, it was desperate. I smiled as I read it. It was clear Karen was feeling the pressure. She knew the stakes had shifted. She knew I was no longer just some powerless neighbor fighting for his lawn. I was a man with leverage, legal leverage, and I had every intention of using it. Later that evening, I received a phone call from Tom, the neighbor who had supported me at the HOA meeting. He had been keeping his ear to the ground and had heard some disturbing things. Apparently, the developer Karen had worked with was under federal investigation for fraudulent practices, including the very permits that had allowed the development of Willow Creek Estates to move forward without the necessary environmental checks. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear. Karen wasn't just facing a property dispute, she was facing professional ruin. The realization was bittersweet. As much as I wanted justice, I couldn't help but feel for Karen in that moment. She had fought so hard to control everything, her neighborhood, her reputation, her professional standing, but in the end, her own actions were coming back to haunt her. As I sat in my kitchen that night, preparing to take the next step in this legal battle, I had a moment of clarity. This fight had started as a simple struggle to reclaim my lawn, my land, my peace. But it had grown into something much bigger than that. I wasn't just standing up for my own rights. I was fighting for everyone who had been silenced by the HOA, for everyone who had been taken advantage of by people like Karen. And in that moment I realized, this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about fighting for what was right, for standing up to the bullies, for making sure that no one would ever be forced to sit quietly while their rights were stripped away. It all came to a head in the most unexpected way. A few weeks after I'd discovered the legal loophole regarding the water rights, things started to unravel for Karen. It began with the investigations. I'd submitted my findings to the authorities, including the evidence about the water rights, the developer's negligence, and Karen's involvement in securing improper permits. Word traveled fast in the tight-knit community of Willow Creek, and soon enough, the HOA, her colleagues, and even some of her neighbors began to question her actions. The first sign of her downfall came when the HOA board held a special meeting. I wasn't invited, of course, Karen had made sure of that, but I didn't need to be there to know what was happening. The whispers were loud enough. The board had started to realize they had been manipulated into supporting her overreach. Tom, the neighbor who'd helped me, had worked behind the scenes to rally a few members of the HOA, and they were starting to piece together the truth about her manipulations. That's when the real bombshell dropped. Karen's professional life began to crumble. The state attorney general's office had launched an investigation into her connection with the developer's fraudulent practices. She had been playing a dangerous game of real estate and legal manipulation, using her position as HOA president to further her own interests. The legal exposure of her involvement made her professional connections begin to dissolve one by one. The law firm she worked with dropped her, and even her local reputation as a community leader started to erode. But the moment that sealed her fate came when the HOA board finally realized they had been complicit in her abuse of power. A few brave members of the HOA, ones who had been under Karen's thumb for far too long, exposed her. They had enough of her reign of terror, enough of her manipulation. At the HOA meeting, they removed Karen as president. It wasn't a dramatic scene, no shouting or confrontation. It was quiet, almost too quiet, as the realization set in. Karen's days of controlling everything were over. The vote to remove her was almost unanimous, and as the decision was finalized, she sat there, her face pale, her mouth dry. There was no defiance, no smugness, just defeat. As Karen stood up to leave, she was served with legal papers, a lawsuit from the developer. It turned out that she wasn't the only one facing charges for their involvement. The development project, under her watch, was about to face a full investigation into the environmental violations and the misuse of community funds. I could hear the murmurs in the room as Karen walked out. Her life, her empire of control, had begun to crumble before her eyes. The chaos that followed was swift. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up against Karen began to find their voices. The HOA started to shift its focus from control to actual community improvement. The new HOA board implemented fairer rules, transparency in meetings, and a new neighborhood code of conduct that respected personal space and individual rights. For me, it wasn't just about Karen's defeat. It was about regaining my life, my peace. My lawn had returned to its natural state, the way it had always been, without the fear of it being trampled by someone else's selfish agenda. I felt a sense of freedom that I hadn't experienced in a long time. The spikes in my yard, my actions, had served as the spark that ignited change, not just in my life, but in the entire neighborhood. The victory was not just legal, it was personal. But what I didn't expect was how much my stand would resonate with the community. I started getting messages from neighbors, people I'd never spoken to before, telling me how they had been too scared to stand up to Karen and the HOA. They thanked me for shaking things up, for showing them that sometimes you had to take a stand, even when it seemed like the world was stacked against you. The community slowly began to heal. The fear that had gripped it for so long started to fade, replaced with a new sense of unity. People were no longer afraid to voice their opinions, to stand up for what was right. It wasn't just about property rights anymore. It was about personal freedom, about reclaiming the spaces that were ours to begin with. And that's when I realized how much I had grown in the process. This fight wasn't just about winning a small battle for my lawn, it was about something bigger. I had reclaimed my peace, but more importantly, I had empowered others to do the same. I had shown them that standing up to bullies, standing up to the people who try to push us around, was the first step to taking back control of our lives. One evening, as I sat on the porch, my lawn as pristine as ever, I looked out over the neighborhood. There was a sense of calm in the air, a feeling of hope that hadn't been there before. I smiled to myself, feeling the weight of the past months lift from my shoulders. The lessons learned had been hard-earned, but they were lessons I would never forget. I had done what needed to be done. I had fought for what was right, and in the end, it was worth it. I stood up, stretching my arms toward the sky, feeling the last remnants of tension leave my body. The future was bright now. The neighborhood had changed, but so had I. I wasn't just a man fighting for his lawn anymore. I was someone who had fought for his freedom and in the process had changed the very fabric of his community. With the sun setting behind me, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for so long. And as the stars began to twinkle above, I knew one thing for sure: no one was going to take this from me again. Looking back on everything that happened, it still feels like a blur, like a lifetime wrapped up in a series of confrontations, legal threats, and moments of doubt. At the start of it all, I was just a man trying to protect his lawn, his space. But what I didn't realize then was that this fight wasn't just about grass or property lines. It was about standing up for something bigger than myself. I had to learn the hard way that sometimes standing up for your rights means facing down people who have far more power than you, and it's never easy. The pressure to conform, to back down, can be overwhelming. But I also learned something important through all of this. Personal boundaries are worth protecting, no matter what. You can't let anyone trample over your peace, your space, or your history, just because they think they can. When I planted those spikes, I was thinking about my lawn. But as everything unfolded, I realized it was never just about the lawn. It was about dignity. It was about not letting anyone take away what was rightfully mine, and standing up to the bullies who think they can control everything. I'm not proud of everything I did during this process. I questioned myself at times. Was I too harsh? Did I go too far? But in the end, I came to understand that sometimes you have to take extreme measures to restore balance, and I didn't hurt anyone in the process. I took a stand, not just for my land, but for the people who had been too afraid to stand up before me. And now, here I am, sitting on my porch, looking at the lawn that once symbolized my frustration and now represents my victory. The neighborhood has changed, and so have I. Where there was once tension, there's now a sense of calm. I've reclaimed my place, not just in the community, but in my own life. The battle was never just about the lawn. It was about reclaiming peace, about regaining control over the things that matter. And most importantly, it was about showing everyone, including myself, that sometimes you have to fight for your own happiness. If you've ever been pushed around by an HOA, a Karen, or anyone else trying to control your space, I want to hear your story. Share your experiences in the comments below. I'm sure there's more out there just like mine. Let's create a community where we can all share, learn, and stand up for what's right. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories of standing up, reclaiming peace, and fighting for what's yours, hit that subscribe button and follow along for more. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Remember, the battle for your peace is worth it. Don't let anyone take it from you.